OWS fam, the nation, my dudes and dudettes, Hilow here for one of our final Best Ball Plus industry experts brought to you by 1 Week Season. And it only made sense on this one, being one of our last goes at this, to bring in a man who I'm going to be speaking with every single Saturday during the regular season, and that is Mr. Xandamere. For those not familiar with 1 Week Season, Xandamere and I, through the inner circle portion of 1 Week Season's DFS offerings, will bring a complete slate breakdown from an analytical perspective, theoretical perspective, and conceptual perspective on Saturday mornings this year. And we do that to get this overall macro strategy kind of session in right before we, I guess, on Saturdays, before we go live on the slate on Sunday. So without further ado, we'll bring him in. OWS fam knows who this man is. Might not have seen his face yet, but here is my man, Xandamere. What's going on, dude?
I'm shy. I haven't really done video content, as you can tell by like how you have this very professional looking, office setup behind you, and I'm in my basement. And my wife is an artist, so lots of like crafting and art stuff back behind me.
Oh, dude, I didn't know that. Even I've known you for years. I didn't even know that.
I got to get a swanky setup like you. Yeah, she has all kinds of crafting and art, but she makes her job is she makes silicone mermaid tails like that you can swim with. They're really sweet.
What?
But I'm not here to plug my wife's business.
We're going to have to talk about that offline at some point. I had no idea. That's awesome, man. X, you are our primary contributor to Showdown content at 1 Week Season. You are also the co-host of the Slate podcast with me on Saturday mornings, as we alluded to earlier. Talk to me about kind of what aspects of this kind of Showdown mindset, and you're kind of the Showdown guru for us, right? Talk about some of the aspects of like this Showdown mindset that you think are most applicable to some of the things that we've been talking about throughout this offseason, the different contests that we have, regular BBMs, weekly winners, the Eliminator, and how you kind of bring those into once we start playing like full slate DFS stuff.
Yeah, that's actually, okay, that's a really interesting question. So Showdown, just, I assume everyone knows, but Showdown is a single game DFS, right? You're betting on just, the slate is one game. And so mentality of Showdown to be successful there is you have to have a very risk on approach. You can play Showdown cash games, and they're still, even a few years into the format, they're still relatively soft. But in tournaments, it's very top heavy. There's a lot of roster duplication because there's only so many players to pick from when you only have, 2 teams worth of players to pick. So there's a tremendous amount of roster duplications. You have to think about uniqueness quite a bit, much more so than on a full slate roster. And you have to borrow from one of our other articles we publish every week, you have to be willing to lose, right? Like, my approach to Showdown is you have to be willing to take big stands, and you have to be willing to lose, and you have to be willing to play suboptimal plays in order to differentiate yourself. Because what you don't want to have happen is you enter 100. Like, I've been there before, where I've entered 150 lineups in a Showdown contest, and I've won first, and I've lost money because I wasn't careful enough to avoid duplication, and I was duped with 300 other people or whatever, and the prize pool didn't cover the cost of 150 entries. So it's a very sort of risk on type of format. The advantage is, unlike, say, if you're playing NFL DFS, one of the challenges of NFL DFS is small sample size. If you're playing main slates, you only got 18 of them in a year, not counting playoffs, right? 18 regular season slates. And actually, until recently, it was only 17. And so even if you're a really good player, it can take a while to realize your positive expected value if you're playing large tournaments. And so in Showdown, one of the edges you get there is there are a lot of them. There's 3 island games every week, generally speaking, on average, with really big tournaments. But the sites now even have Showdown tournaments for the smaller, the main slate games. You can play, you can get 15 Showdown tournaments in a week. And so that makes it easier to feel like I can take this risk on approach, because if I lose, there's always another one. There's more later today in the afternoon slate. There's another one. There's an island game tomorrow. And so for me, at least, that makes it easier to take that sort of risk on approach in Showdown. And I feel like that's made me a better player on main slates as well. And I think I also try to take some of that mentality to best ball as well, where I think about, you can draft according to your rankings. And if your rankings are good, then you're going to end up with a roster that looks solid on paper. But if a lot of people are using similar rankings that are drafting according to ADP, you're going to end up competing with a lot of very similar rosters, like same phrase, right? And so, or same concept, right? And so that's that sort of risk-on approach to Showdown has enabled me to be better at taking that sort of risk-on approach to other types of tournaments as well. And if you're playing top-heavy tournaments, like there's very much such a thing as being too cautious, and a lot of DFS players and best ball players are, in my opinion, too cautious.
Yeah, I love that you brought there. Well, there's a lot of things that I guess that you brought up there that I absolutely love, and we're going to talk about more. The primary one that stuck out to me is this idea of willing to lose. What does that mean? And you mentioned also being comfortable straying from optimal. I think that's the way that you put it. I guess one of the ways that we have tried to teach and talk about that specific aspect of playing DFS or playing best ball or some of these number of new contests that have been released on Underdog is this idea that we kind of have a fairly good idea of conceptual optimal practices as far as roster construction goes, as far as like we know player evaluation is very important. But beyond that, we don't really have much of an idea of what is optimal. For example, micro aspects of when you're in a BBM draft is in the 16th round is a ultra ceiling with a very, very wide range of outcomes and a very low floor type player more important than a game stacked player? We don't really know. We don't have that processing power. So this idea of like willing to lose and how you handle and manage variance and the kind of psychological aspects that come into play when you're talking about that are very, very interesting to pull from the perspective of a Showdown kind of mastermind, as we consider you to be, and as you've proven to be, as how do we port those ideas into these other games where, like you said, it goes against human nature more or less when we're talking about like putting ourselves in uncomfortable situations. We've talked about the psychological aspects of these games that we're playing before, where it's like we kind of, as humans, we like to be in control of our own situation. And in a highly variant game, especially on Showdown, where your sample size is one NFL game, that it's very, very difficult to do. So I wanted to pose that question to you to kind of port those two ideas over to these other contests that we're now transitioning to, being best ball, being DFS, being main slate stuff, in this idea of like, how do we make these exploitations away from conceptual optimal? We know kind of what that is based on simply the contest rules. How do we then parlay that into creating exploits that actually generate plus EV scenarios? So super, super interesting. I want to now kind of transition the discussion to one of the newer contests that was just released on Underdog, being the Eliminator. We have this really, really interesting contest, and I did one quick session for those Best Ball Plus peeps that are watching. I did one session on Wednesday about the first Eliminator that was released, and then that day, the little Eliminator was released, and it is a completely, entirely different contest, even though it shares kind of a similar name. I want to ask you first, did you get any of the $50 Eliminator contest? Did you get any drafts in on that bad boy?
I did not. That thing filled so fast, and I was so focused on, on drafters, honestly, on trying to maximize that tournament because of the overlay. I was so focused there that I didn't even notice it until it was full. But I'm really excited about this one. The format is super new and interesting. And as we've seen in these types of formats over the years, whether it's DFS or best ball, new format equals edge, because it means people have had less time to study it, to dissect it. There's no past historical data to look at. And so, as was the case with the original DFS game, in 2011, whenever it first came out, for the first few years, as was the case in Showdown for the first couple years, like new formats mean edge. So I'm really excited about it.
So we'll go over the format really quick, and then I kind of want to hear your initial reactions to game plan development in this format. As you look, these are the groupings that you're placed in week to week, and obviously this is a survivor style contest where we're looking to basically just survive and advance. The big difference is in the first eliminator that was released, the round 17 was a 6-person grouping. You were fighting to survive until the final round, week 17, and only be competing against 5 other teams. In this new one, now we have a fairly significantly sized small field GPP that we're fighting against on 185 other teams. So talk to me real quick about kind of how that shifts the mindset in this new contest as would be compared to when you're playing against 5 other teams.
Yeah, the structure of this is really interesting because when you think about it from a survive and advance standpoint, that seems to lend you to think about building rosters that try to maximize floor, right? I don't have to be everyone in my group. I only have to be in the top, 75%, or the percentage changes week to week, right? But
yeah,
I only have to be in the top, 50% or more than 50%, right? So I basically just have to not suck each week in order to advance. And so that tends to make you think about drafting rosters that are really all about maximizing floor. However, when you get to round 17, it's 186 people. And the payout structure of this tournament is quite top heavy. It's a 500K prize pool total. I figured this out, about roughly 250K of that is in round 17, that 186 person final. But of that, the bulk is like the top, the top five spots are the only spots that get you, a 5-figure or above payday. The top 10 spots are the only spots that get you a 4-figure or above payday. So if you're thinking about like significant money, significant upside, you can't just draft purely for floor, because you want to make sure that your team, if it gets to the finals, that you have enough ceiling in order to make a realistic run at that top spot. Because, you don't want to get to the finals and you end up at 185th place and you get $100, which, for a $6 entry, cool, but you maxed it, that's $120, of entries into this thing. So you're not really making any money. And so it's an interesting balance here between floor to get you there, but still ceiling. And like, you can't draft pure floor to get there even either. It's sort of like the mistake of drafting pure floor in DFS cash games, where your roster actually ends up being quite fragile, where if you don't have ceiling on it, then like one guy gets hurt or has a poor game, and you don't have, high ceiling options elsewhere that can pull you back up. And so this is kind of like that, where it's like you need a interesting mix of floor and ceiling in order to optimize your chance of getting there, but also, give you a realistic shot at hitting a top 10 if you do manage to get to the final.
Yeah, in normal best ball, the way that I think about different methodologies that we use within that contest is the heaviest influence to advance rate is roster construction. So how do we construct our roster to make it out of the first 14 weeks? And then get into this area of those contests where we're more concerned about single week ranges of outcomes, about correlations, about game stacking, about team stacks, about all the things that we know are conceptually driven to boost our expected value. In this contest, where we have to now survive for 16 weeks to get to this area of the contest where single game ranges of outcomes really, really matter to us, it's this interesting balancing act. When I did my podcast for Wednesday, where it was on the first eliminator, it was like, oh my God, all these volume running backs that are in the middle rounds, your Dameon Pierces, your James Connors, your Rashad Whites, your Miles Sanders, those guys who are expected to carry fairly significant week-to-week volume, but they're on 1, shitty offenses, 2, in shitty situations, 3, behind shitty offensive lines. Those guys were extremely valuable in the first eliminator contest, where it's like volume drives the bottom end range of outcomes. We know that I just want to survive, finish in the top 50% and move on. Well, it's like in this contest, those guys and that grouping of running backs in those middle rounds that are the volume running backs in kind of crappy situations, they lose a little bit of luster in this format but still are a little bit more valuable than when compared to a tournament like BBM, where we can mask those inefficiencies over a 14-week sample. So it's a very interesting setup. And this is just all conceptual based on the rules of the contest that we're playing. We're not even into getting into theoretical optimal. How do we maximize for expected value? Those kind of beyond that top level layer of thinking. These are just staring us in the face, and why we have this up right here, looking at the advancement rates and stuff. And by the way, we didn't mention, if you're not familiar with this contest, 2 teams in each round are being eliminated. So dependent on the group sizes until we get to week 13, where then it's a 50% advancement rate. So 3 out of 6 are advancing. But up until that point, it's 2 are eliminated each week. Yeah, I forgot where I was going now. My train of thought. Jump in next, save me, just like in the slate.
I'll say, okay, so one of the most interesting dynamics to this is people who draft this tournament as if they were drafting a regular best ball tournament are highly likely to torpedo their own teams inadvertently. And what I mean by that is bye weeks. So let's take week 13 as a good example, because week 13 has a lot of really high powered teams on bye. You've got Ravens, Bills, Bears, Raiders, Vikings, and Giants. And if you go look at underdog ADP, you will find that of the top 100 players by ADP, 22% of them are on bye in week 13. If you go to top 150, it's 18.6%. So week 13 is going to be painful for a lot of teams. And what I mean by torpedoing it is let's say you get the 1.1 and you start Justin Jefferson. Cool, grats. And then let's say you think, okay, cool, I'm going to build a Viking stack. And so later on, you want to pick up either TJ Hawkinson or Jordan Addison, and then you pick up Kirk Cousins, and you're feeling good about your Viking stack. And then along the way, you also pick up, say, I don't know, you're excited about Zay Flowers and the Ravens. And then, I don't know, maybe Josh Jacobs falls to you. I'm just picking random players of week 13 buys, basically.
Yeah.
But it's really easy to overexpose yourself to a given week. And your team is going to be really strong for the first 12 weeks of the season. And then you hit week 13, and it's not just about the sheer number of players you have on bye that week. It's about the draft capital you have invested in them, right? You're expecting Justin Jefferson as your first round pick to generate a disproportionate percentage of your roster's total fantasy points compared to your 5th round pick or your 10th round pick. And so, a lot of people are going to follow this same strategy of drafting these premium offenses, and they're going to end up dying late. They're going to feel really good for the first part of the season, and they're going to end up dying in their main team's bye week because they've overstacked that week, because they've approached it like a regular best ball tournament. Because in regular best ball, it's okay to overstack, a week 13 bye, because you're thinking, I have, the whole regular season where that team is building me up a big lead. And then even if I fall back a little in week 13, that's okay. Right? I'm counting on my performance over the whole regular season to push me into the playoffs. And once I'm in the playoffs, I'm not worried about buys. But I think that you're going to see a lot of people here drafting this as if it's a regular best ball tournament. And you're going to see a lot of teams get they're going to die off later on, where the teams they're going to look really strong. Their points per week are going to look really good. But they're going to have this bye week vulnerability where they're going to need a lot of luck to get through that bye week. And so I think it's interesting where you're going to see a lot of really valuable teams like Vikings, for like NFL teams like Vikings that are, that have a lot of combined high ADPs. You're going to see a lot of those teams die. And so you might even, for example, if Justin Jefferson has a really big season, you would expect, as in normal best ball, that you would see a lot of Justin Jefferson teams in the final, because Justin Jefferson carried that team. And, pick any first round player or second round player and say, this guy has the best season of his round. You generally would expect to see a lot of those teams in the finals. But in this format, you might not, especially with the later week buys, because the later week buys, the farther on you go, the more competitive the tournament gets, the more you're up against well-constructed, good rosters from players who are having good seasons. And so, those late week buys are going to really be killer for a lot of people. And I think that that's an opportunity where, we talked about new format equals edge. And this is an example where, people haven't studied that yet. You still see people, I've only done 5 drafts of this, right? But I've still seen people largely putting together very similar rosters to how they would approach, the best ball million or BBM, whatever, BBM 4. See, I'm out of touch with underdog and I'm playing on drafters.
Yeah.
But you basically see people taking the same approach, which, so that's where our edge is figuring out how to approach this differently to take advantage of the unique dynamics of this tournament.
Yeah, and if as I bring the payouts here, we're not getting paid in this contest, which is a little different than the first Eliminator, but we're not getting paid in this contest until week 9. That's an interesting distinction, and I think how you handle that, it depends on kind of your variance management profile, kind of how you are looking to leverage or manage variance in your favor or make it work for you. Some people are taking this to, hey, I'm getting paid money in week 9. I'm going to prioritize bye weeks that are after that. And that's an interesting dynamic because, like you said, I mean, look at the teams that are on bye in week 13. You've got the Giants, you've got the Bills, you have the Vikings, like you discussed, the Bears, the Ravens. There's a lot of high-powered or expected to be high-powered and valuable offenses that are on bye later on in the season. Even week 11 has some interesting ones with New England and Indianapolis. The fact of the matter is, I think that we should be looking at this. And again, this goes into, now we're into the theoretics. We're past the conceptual portion of this discussion. We're into the theoretics. It depends on the payout. If we were getting 2x the buy-in just for min cashing in getting to week 9, that would influence the expected value a little bit, that equation a little bit differently than if the min cash was getting our money back per entry. Similarly, if making the finals was at least break even for maxing this contest, that would influence those decisions a little bit differently. Because this contest is so top heavy, you look at the top 10. First is 100K, 10th place, $1,000. How different is that? That is like it's not really necessarily life-changing money, but that's a pretty good year, right? The 100K, the $1,000, that's not moving the needle anywhere for almost anybody playing this contest. So the fact that and that's only from 10 positions, from first to 10th, the fact that it is so top heavy, I think it matters less, this idea of trying to manage variance through bye weeks more than how do we optimize for week 17 once we're there. Obviously, we got to get there. And how do we get there? We get there through roster construction, and we get there through the roster, how it comes together as a whole, how we mask those other inefficiencies, one being bye week, two being positional roster allocation, all those things that we've kind of talked about in other places. But the focus in this, even I would say it has to be at least on par with BBM, potentially maybe even more, because it's mathematically easier to get to the finals in this contest. So I don't know. That's an interesting theoretical discussion. Do you have any, I guess, reactions to that? Like, as far as what is the most important thing in this contest? What do we need to be focusing on here?
I do want to note something to tangent off something you said. You talked about bye weeks and how people could easily overrate the importance of bye weeks and say, well, you need earlier bye weeks, which I think you are seeing a little bit in the drafts, right? Like, for example, in the ones I've done, I commonly see Justin Herbert with a bye week of 5 go before Joe Burrow with a bye week of 7. Like a lot of those guys do go a little bit earlier. I do think there's one relevant point to note, though, around earlier bye weeks, which is it's not just about reaching the payout level. It's that surviving the earlier weeks is going to be easier because that's when the dead rosters are weeded out in the first few weeks. Now, you might argue that by week 5, when the first buys start in the NFL, you're probably not facing a lot of dead rosters by that point. They probably got weeded out in the first couple of weeks. But I think it's probably fair to think that, as you advance further and further, the rosters that you're left competing with are stronger and stronger. And so getting buys out of the way early when you're facing weaker competition, it's not just about trying to reach week 9 for payout for that, $6 or whatever. It's about recognizing that you want to align, or at least one way to build is to try to align so that your team is at its strongest when it's facing the strongest competition. Now, of course, you still have to sun run in week 17 after the buys are done, and all the weeks after the buys are done, right? After week 15 through 17, you still have to get fortunate to win those last few weeks because buys are no longer part of the equation at that point. But like I took a stab at building a couple of rosters that have almost every single player with buys week 10 and before, and thinking like, yeah, I'm going to have to get lucky to make it through week 10. But if I do, now I'm in a really strong position against all those other teams that have buys coming up in weeks 11 and and 13, and not really so much 14, a little bit 14, right? But mostly 11 and 13. I'm in a really strong position against those teams. My roster is essentially at full strength while they're playing those matchups with a handicap. Like, you're going to have handicapped weeks where you're missing players due to buys, right? Like, that's every player has to work around that. I think that, it's one approach, and I don't know it's the right approach necessarily because we're all new to this, but one viable approach is trying to align your weakness with where the softest areas of the tournament are.
That's super interesting. And listening to that, not necessarily that it would be my rebuttal, because it's not that I disagree from a theoretical perspective of that, but the fact that once we get into these weeks where bye weeks are like week 10 and on, where it's like week 10 is there's a lot of teams on bye and there's a lot of important teams on bye. Week 11, there's some important teams on bye. And then week 13, obviously, is the big one where there's a ton of important teams on bye. If we were in this, so compare this to the first Eliminator, where the first Eliminator, it was, I hope this was done on purpose. I think it was. But the hardest week in that contest to advance was week 13. It was 15 out of a pod or a grouping of 31 teams. So that in a contest like that, where they very clearly were considering that as a strategic element in play in that contest, by making that the hardest week to advance and making it pods of 31 teams, I think that discussion is a little bit more pertinent to a structure like that, whereas it's a little bit flatter in this new contest where it's at minimum 50% in each week. And when you get to these weeks where we're talking about, we're no longer in, yes, it's easier to advance because we're 2 of 12 aren't being eliminated as we start with, or 2 of 11, then it trickles down, 2 of 9 are eliminated, and so on. It's 3 of 6, but it's still only a pod of 6 teams, which is interesting. I don't know where I stand on that, but I think that's my initial theoretical. And again, not necessarily a rebuttal because I think it is important. I just think that might be overstated. And if that is, I think the best way to put this is that is probably an edge right now because fewer of the field are doing it. I think we're going to see the knee-jerk reaction, probably not in this contest, but as more discussion is had about this format, where it probably is going to swing the other way, the pendulum wise, into it's probably not as important as I think the field might eventually make it out to be. But right now, yeah, I think that's an interesting, again, theoretical micro edge, thinking about how I can take these contest rules that are given to me and maximize for that. I brought up this screen here for an interesting reason, and it's these like mega fallers. So obviously Jerry Jeudy, the big news there. Obviously Breece Hall, the big news with the signing of Dalvin Cook. But we're starting to see these guys I think I took a Jerry Jeudy, and I think it was in the late 6th round, just this morning. At what point do you kind of say that player can be extremely beneficial late in the season, where it's most of the EV is coming from? And I'm just going to kind of try and make it until that point. I guess another example, Jameson Williams, obviously, who is that's a steep cliff to overcome in this contest. But at what point are these guys become? I hate using the word value, but it's at what point do we start taking shots on these players where we know they're probably out 4 to 6 weeks to start the year?
Yeah, I have it's funny. I actually had Jameson Williams written down in my notes as someone I wanted to talk about. But to your point, right? Essentially what you're saying is there's a player who was drafted here and they got hurt or they're suspended. And so now they're being drafted here, right? Farther down the draft. And so at what point is it worth it to get that player when you're eating some dead weeks from him? In in regular best ball, it's about, you have the whole regular season to accumulate points to make it out of your group. And so in regular best ball, like, yes, players who are missing part of the season and come back, as long as they're back before the groups make out of the groups, like, cool. But only, 2 teams make it out of groups in most best ball formats, right? And so 2 out of 12. So you can't just say, I'm going to eat a 0 from this guy for, 6 weeks and it's no big deal. I'll still draft him where I was drafting him before his injury, because he'll still help me late in the season, because he's only to get to late in the season. Here, the difference is that each week is a cut, and each cut is going to get sequentially tougher to make. And so the earliest cuts are the easiest. And so in my mind, the guys who are missing a few weeks, I think that they lose less value in this format versus regular best ball, where every week is evaluated the same. Fewer teams make the cut to the playoffs. A player who's missing a few weeks, their contribution to you making it to the end of the tournament in this format is going to be greater, because they still come back and, like Alvin Kamara suspended. God, what is it? 3 games? I can't remember. 3 games?
3 games, yeah.
Thank you. So, you missed 3 weeks of Alvin Kamara. Okay. But week 4 onwards, he's helping you, right? Like, and so, if you think about players like Alvin Kamara, James Williams, Jerry Jeudy, JSN, whose name I can never remember, and I just call him JSN, Seattle rookie, right? Like, those guys, I'm actually really interested in them in this format, because the parts of the season they're missing are the softest parts, where not only does the larger percentage of the pool advance, but the competition is going to be softer. And so that combination means that, like, if you're a good drafter and you're building well-constructed rosters and you're using reasonable rankings, and, you should have a very high success rate of getting through the first, 3 or 4 rounds. If you're doing 20 rosters, you should probably beat the field in advancing past the first few rounds. Unless you're taking an extremely risky late season powerhouse approach where you're willing to sacrifice early rosters for that. And so to me, like, those players actually are more valuable in this relative to BBM, because I think there are more individual cut weeks where those players will benefit you. And the weeks where they don't benefit you are the softer, easier weeks to get past anyway. So if I were doing rankings, which I don't, but if I were doing rankings, I would take guys like that and all the guys who are out some number of weeks, and I'd probably move them up a smidge in the rankings for this, if I were doing rankings for this particular tournament. Not enormously so, right? Like, JSN he's not back to being an ADP of 60 or whatever he was before his injury, but I would not ding him as much as I would in BBM.
That's super interesting, and another, like, aspect of that I think is probably going under-noticed is we have to, like, look at what Underdog did and what they were telling us. Are they going to continue with this format, but every time they release a new contest, the advancement rates are going to be different, or the contest rules are going to be different? The week 17 pods going to be different. To me, it's interesting that Underdog released a tester contest on this format, the Eliminator, $50 entry, and there were only like 5,500 entries into it. It fills in under 24 hours, and then they release a contest, the Little Eliminator. So again, name is very similar, but it's a vastly different conceptual contest. Do you think they're going to keep us on our toes here by, like, tweaking the rules and the underlying contest? I don't know. I don't even know what to call it. The governing bodies of that contest and how we conceptualize it and plan and develop our game plan for it. Do you think they're going to keep tweaking those? Do you think it's going to be like they're going to fall on a specific format? Or do you think this is kind of their, like, let's challenge the users to this moving target and see how they react?
My guess is that at some point they will arrive at a standard, but it's probably not this season. My guess is, if you look at the fill rate, Little Eliminator came out on Tuesday. It's Friday, and it's like almost 50% full. So my guess is there will be at least one more Eliminator style tournament. What size, what price point, no clue. But I mean, Underdog's a business, right? Their job is to maximize the number of entries they get, the amount of revenue they bring in. I think they would be silly not to redo a higher price point Eliminator at some point before the season, given that the first one filled in under 24 hours. Why would you not do that? There's demand for it, right? There's a lot of customer demand for this format. People find it really interesting. And so I expect they will. And I expect that, at some point they will get to a sort of standard, and it's probably going to be more than one standard. They might have, little eliminators in the future that are kind of more structured like this one with a larger final round. They might have the, smaller field, higher dollar eliminators that are structured like the first one, kind of like how, DraftKings has its large field GPPs and its smaller field, single entry or 3-max GPPs, right? Like they want to try and cater to different players who buy in at different price points, have different bankrolls, and also just who prefer different tournament sizes or different payout structures. So I would expect, like, given the demand for this, it seems like customers are really interested. People want to play this. So I don't think it's going away. I think there will probably be at least one more Eliminator style tournament before kickoff this year. And I think we'll probably see even more of it next year. And, we might even see much bigger ones, probably not the scale of BBM, but like we might see a $1 million tournament or a $2 million prize pool tournament next year. So
yeah, that'd be awesome.
The demand is there. I think it's a super, super interesting and fascinating format. It plays off of the popularity of survivor pools and season long, for season long players. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to tell if they're, how they're thinking about the actual, the individual dynamics they use. Because to your point, just calling it an Eliminator tournament, given the two we've seen so far, it gives you a conceptual overview. Teams are eliminated each week, but those two tournaments are vastly different in terms of the structure, where the cut lines are, where the, how the prize pool is allocated, and thus how what your strategy needs to be to approach it, right? They're vastly, vastly different. So I don't think it's to be clear, what we're not doing here is giving you is Eliminator strategy for all Eliminators from now to the end of time. We're giving you strategy for this tournament because it's very different than the last one. And if they come up with another one, we may have to do this again.
Yeah. I mean, it's exciting to me as from my core being a theorist, taking these concepts or these contests, conceptualizing how we maximize EV, and then kind of bringing in the field observations and the assumptions that we make to develop a game plan. Not that the field is not good at that third step. So there's I like to break it up into 3 different distinct areas of what makes a good game player. It's you have your analytical tier where it's being able to parse numbers, being able to take what's happened before, maybe utilize predictive analytics through an optimizer or whatever the case may be. Then you have the conceptual stuff, which is taking the rules of the contest, digesting those, and developing or tweaking that initial game plan. And then you bring in that third layer of the theory of how do we take what we're seeing from the field and how do we then generate these exploits to further increase our expected value. And I think the field through DFS thinking, through not a lot, but there's a number of people that are kind of in our sphere that come from poker where they're taught and we're trained to think like that. So we're seeing more and more of that. But when these contests are just launched, there's very, very, I would say, I'll go out on a limb here and say there's very, very small portion of the field that is getting to that third layer and thinking through beyond just the contest rules, beyond the analytics, how do I then marry those with what I expect the field to do based on what's there? And that's kind of the entire premise of a lot of what we do on the slate during DFS season, where we're bringing in that third tier of thinking to analyze kind of where we are and where we expect the field to be. How do we then exploit that? That's what we do at 1 week season with Inner Circle subscribers. Will get access to a piece I put out at the end of the week, which is the end around. And that is that third tier of theoretical thinking. So yeah, I think this is a super interesting discussion that we're having because we're kind of diving into that third tier of analysis, which I think is important particularly for these new contests where I don't think a large portion of the field is kind of getting there yet. And that's why I posed that question. Do we expect Underdog to keep giving us these little minor tweaks that change a lot of that third tier analysis? I hope they do. That's my, I really hope they do, because
New
this is
equals
fun.
edge always, right? Like
Yeah.
I tend to think about like layers of thinking as well. And I wrote a course on OWS last year in which I talked about these like layers of thinking as it applies to DFS, and talked about sort of the evolution of DFS and the evolution of the layers of thinking and sort of where the field is. And if you go read that, you can see like the mapping of like in this year, back in this year, most of the field is doing this and the sharpest players are doing this. And so it's always just about like being successful in this space is always about staying ahead of the field. And in some ways, it's not about being smarter than the field. It's about being able to reasonably estimate what the field is doing, and saying, do I want to do that or not? Like the olden days of DFS, right? Like a backup running back would get a start and he'd be 20% owned in a tournament, right? That was a great play, because a backup running back at minimum salary on a good team with a high team total, getting all the touches, like at 20% ownership or 15% ownership in the old days of DFS, that was an awesome play. Then as DFS evolved and people said, yes, backup running back getting starts, that's a really good play, the ownership of those guys started skyrocketing. It started being like 50%, 60%, 70%. And then maybe not such a good play. Or at least if you're going to play that player, you need to understand how to play him and build a roster around him. And so that was the next level of thinking, right? And so it's not about, was the running back a good play? It's about, how do you approach this decision point that everyone playing this weekend is going to have to make their own call on? How do you estimate what the field is likely to do? And how do you react to that in a way that continues to give you an edge? And over time, in the world of DFS, I don't want to say it's solved, right? It's not, but it's certainly a lot farther along that process of developing, in the world of poker, they call it like game theory optimal, right? Like, we're a lot closer to that in the DFS space than we are in the best ball space. And we're certainly nowhere near that point in the Eliminator space, because it just started on, last week or whatever, whenever the first one was posted, right? So, like that's why being early gives you edge, is if you're able to apply this kind of thinking to these early tournaments, these brand new frontiers, your level of thinking is more advanced than most of the people you're competing with.
Talk to me, Goose. I love that, to bringing up game theory optimal. I brought this up for a very interesting reason, and it goes into kind of what you were talking about. It's like Xandamere White, Deion Jackson. There's all this uncertainty, ambiguity associated with those teams right now. We have Josh Jacobs, he's not only holding out, he has not signed his franchise tender still. And we're 10 days, 10, 11, 12, I don't know, somewhere in there, under 2 weeks until the start of the NFL season, so we're 13
He's
days
in fact tweeting about how he's not signing it when someone else said like sources say Jacobs is reporting to camp, and he's like, fuck you, no, I'm not.
And that source, let's make this very clear. That source was Dov Kleiman. So that's the only source that has put out, we expect Josh Jacobs to be back to camp. Anyway, that's a story for a different day. But Xandamere White, what happens if Josh Jacobs continues to hold out into the regular season? What happens if we see Indianapolis, they don't get, God, I can't think of his name. Jesus Christ. Yeah, Jonathan Taylor. Thank you. I'm going on very little sleep, so we are doing our best here. What happens if Jonathan Taylor's like, okay, I'm willing to lose some paychecks, because Jonathan Taylor's situation is so interesting, because his owner, the owner of the Indianapolis Colts, came out and said, or I guess had some choice words about the running back meeting, the Zoom meeting, the call that they had to address the state of the valuation of the running back position in today's game. He basically came out and said, like, those guys need to basically shut up and play. And it's like, dude, that's not flying with Jonathan Taylor. So that's a very unique situation in that, like, does he prioritize what he believes in over the paycheck? If he starts missing games, he's missing his paycheck. But like, I don't know. What happens if he doesn't get traded by Tuesday, which is the arbitrary deadline that the team gave him? I don't know. If both of those situations, Jonathan Taylor and Josh Jacobs, do not play week 1, where's the field looking for their running backs? It's like this. So very interesting. Not that they would be terrible plays, but are they worthy of like shipping a major GPP? I don't know. But that said, that same mindset of how do we not only look at the analytics, these players would be amazing on paper plays from a point per dollar standpoint in week one, should they be the starting running backs on their respective team. How do we then take the conceptual aspect of how does that now fit on a roster and the theoretical aspects of how do we expect the field to handle that and then build that in? Working backwards to these new contests and to best ball and to props betting, which we're going to talk to here shortly. I got the props master as well on here with me. So all those things, like how do we get to that third layer of thinking of, I know these guys are on the good on paper plays. Does that mean they're going to ship tournaments? What happens if they don't? How do I now build a roster to harness that? Talk about it from best ball. These players should be they should not be 17th, 18th round picks anymore. Like they should be 14th, 15th, 16th round picks. So draft these players. That notwithstanding, these are highly valuable potential ranges of outcomes. Similar to like guys like Tajay Spears, guys who are direct backups to volume. That's very different when you're talking about or comparing that situation to like a 50-50 split backfield where it will almost certainly never become more than that. Like Philadelphia, Washington, Miami. Those players are valuable because we're most likely every week going to get points from a lot of the contributors in those backfields. We're also not likely to ever get extreme volume from those situations. So guys like Tajay Spears, Zamir White, Deion Jackson, these are a little bit different of an animal when you're talking about their potential range of outcomes. And obviously it takes some things breaking in their favor, but these are valuable assets from like best ball or from Eliminator or from any of these season-long contests that are not really being treated like that. So yeah, that's kind of full circle on that idea of harnessing variance, leveraging it into our favor through that like third layer of theoretical thinking. Anything to add on that before we start talking about some props, dude?
Yeah, I'll just first note, I mean, take the names out of this because we're assuming who the beneficiary would be, right? And in what you have in your screenshot here. Yeah. It's probably the most likely option, right? But like keep in mind, we don't know. And it's week one. We know not very much. And so, you have to think about how you want to approach. Like, let's say that it happens. Let's say Jonathan Taylor and Josh Jacobs don't play week one. Probably one of the most critical decisions you will have to make in DFS and in week one is how do I handle the starting running back for the Raiders and the starting running back for the Colts, no matter if it's White or Jackson or if it's Hull or Moss for the Colts or whatever. And so, there's forks in that road. You can think, I'm just going to play them because they're the best on paper plays in the week. Cool, do that. But think about how you differentiate your roster elsewhere. In order to take down big tournaments, you're going to need some differentiation. You could say, I bet only one of them hits and say, I'm only going to play one of them on any given roster, right? Like, okay, that's fine too. You can say, I'm just going to bet they both fail. Cool. Like all of these are viable paths, right? The point is there's not a right answer to this question. The point is that you make these decisions in a matrix of other decisions. So there's no right or wrong answer to should I play Zamir White and or Deion Jackson. The thing you have to recognize is that your answer to that question is going to influence the answers to other questions that you have to answer as you're building out your week one strategy.
Mm-hmm. We're going to save the rest of that discussion for the slate.
If Jacobs and Jonathan Taylor miss, we'll probably spend an hour on that topic.
Yeah. Yeah. And also for the OWS fam that is Inner Circle members and listening to this, we are going to be moving the slate podcast to a different time. This week, we're going to make it earlier in the day to make the listening easier. And we're also going to try and stop at an hour and a half, which very routinely we pushed it to 2 hours last year. And we're going to try. You have my word that we're going to try, but X and I like to talk. And so, no, I'm just kidding. We have a lot of information to get through in those podcasts. Let's now transition. We've covered the new contest. We've talked about some best ball. We've talked about theoretical, how we get to that third level of thinking. And now we've talked a little bit about DFS. I want to spend these last 10 minutes talking a little bit about props. And if you're not familiar, 1 week season, we launched a props service last year. We've tweaked it this year. So talk to me a little bit about the value of props, what players or what people are going to be getting in that subscription, and kind of where we're going from here.
Absolutely. Yeah. So last year we started props for NFL and NBA. And it was a really successful season, really, frankly, more so in NBA. NBA was like our cash cow. We ended the NBA season total across both packages. We were up 90 something units. And so just, if you're not super familiar with the betting world, a unit is the amount that you put into play on a given bet. That's like your normal bet. And so it's $25 or $50 or $100, whatever you feel comfortable per bet. And it had props has its own bankroll management principles. We have a free article on the site if you want to understand our recommendations on bankroll management principles for betting. But so 90 units, if your unit is $50, right? $50 times 90 would be what you would have made. Like if your unit's $25, it'd be $25 times 90 is what you could have made if you just followed all the picks we made. So really successful for a first year. We were super, super happy how it went. And so we decided to expand it this year. And so instead of doing sport by sport props, which would honestly just become a real pain in the ass for our customers of like, do you sign up for tennis? Do you sign up for golf? Do you sign up for baseball? Do you sign up for competitive swimming? Whatever.
Yeah.
We just have a props.
Point me in that direction. I'm interested in that.
It covers all sports. And it also gives us a lot of flexibility because, props are a relatively new major market for sports books. They've been around for a long time, but they've only become like really popular in the last few years as legalized sports gambling has expanded. And so, they're relatively new, and like everything else with new stuff, there's edge. And NFL props are getting tougher because that's the biggest sport, right? It's like the biggest betting market. And so NFL props have been getting tougher as books are essentially that's where they're investing to try and make sure their lines are really, really sharp. And so like that market's getting tougher. So having it be one sport, one package that covers all sports gives us more flexibility to sort of move where we feel the edge is, as opposed to feeling like, well, we have this NFL package, so we feel compelled that we have to put out a certain number of NFL bets per week, even if they might not meet, even if they might not be as strong as what we really would like to look for. We have to put them out because we have NFL subscribers. So we have an all sports props package. So it's been rolling already since the beginning of the year. It covers all sports it covers all sports whose seasons begin in 2023. And so that means that for the rest of the year, we've got baseball running, we've got golf running, we've got tennis running, and it'll cover NFL, it'll cover NBA. And we're continuing to look at, at OWS, we keep looking for where we find new edge. We've started to see it can we poke into WNBA, like women's basketball? Or are there other, these niche sports? Like what about esports? Like these niche sports often have edge because they're not as heavily bet. And so books don't invest as much time and money to develop really sharp lines and defend those lines. And so, we're looking for where the edge is. We're continuing to release new sports. I guess 3 new sports so far this year. They've been reasonably successful for a first year. I think last accounting, we're up something like 30 units so far this year. And that's, before our biggest sports have launched. So super, super excited for this year's, NFL NBA season to see how we can build on our success from year one. Expecting a really great year. We're also actually, I suppose I can announce this now because JM just sort of fully signed off on it. We're launching a Pick'em product as well. And so
let's go.
Not every customer, right, lives in a state with legalized sports betting. In fact, you, my friend, right?
No, we're good. We're good now. We're good now.
Oh, are you? I'm sorry. See,
Arizona's full up, dude. Yeah, we are good.
Yeah, but so let's say you live in California, right? You cannot place bets on like DraftKings, on FanDuel, on Caesars, on props. And so your choices are either offshore books, which are, somewhat risky because you have no legal recourse should something happen because they're illegal in the United States. But you can also play Pick'em games on sites like Underdog, Prize Picks, Sleeper. And a Pick'em is essentially like they classify it as a DFS contest. And it's, you have to pick 2 different entries. And so, and from players on different teams, much like DFS, right? You have to have players from multiple teams in DFS. And so it might be like, Kirk Cousins under 310.5 passing yards and also Josh Jacobs under 89.5 rushing yards would be like an entry you could make in Pick'em. And there's a lot of people who live in states where where sports books aren't legal, but Pick'em is. And to my knowledge, no major service has a pick'em specific product. And so that leaves customers trying to be like, I'm just going to take these individual props and try to put my pick'em slips together from them. But a good prop does not necessarily make a good pick'em bet based on the line. You know, a prop that's at negative 115 juice is not a good pick'em bet because the implied odds on all pick'em bets on underdog, for example, are roughly negative 137 is how the math plays out. And so you can't just necessarily take a prop and apply it to pick'em. And so we're trying to focus specifically on pick'em. I think it's an underserved area of the market. And so if you're in a state, and we've heard this from a lot of our customers, I'd love to sign up for your props package, but I only have access to underdog, prize picks, those. This is now a package that is specifically targeted at you. And so it's a much lower price point because it's much more limited in the lines and books available. But I think it's a really cool new concept that we're pushing because it just isn't out there yet. Like we haven't really seen it. And so really excited to get that launched. That'll be up on the site sometime before the end of next week, I expect. And it's going to be for NFL and NBA. So, on the whole, man, and props are cool because like when we talk about DFS, we talk about best ball. If you're playing tournaments, only one person can win BBM. Right. And so we're trying to give people great information to help maximize their odds of winning. But at the end of the day, all of our best ball subscribers can't all win the BBM. All of our DFS subscribers can't all win the DraftKings Millie Maker in the same week. Right. There's only one person taking first. Cool thing about props is everyone can win.
Let's win together, man.
Yeah. And we have a team of people with multi-year track records of success. And obviously, we can't guarantee that we're going to turn a profit. Like that's impossible. That's up to the athletes on the field. In addition, we have to select good lines, but the athletes in the field also have to perform as we expect them to perform. But I think we have a multi-year track record across multiple sports of having done this successfully. And if you talk to people who've been in our props package, I think they'll say that it was successful for them and they made money off it. And that's really, it's a fun feeling to all cheer together. Like by the end of by Sunday afternoon in our Discord, right, there's usually a couple of people, a small number of people who have serious sweats going on for DFS tournaments, and we're all cheering for them. And that's awesome, right? Yeah. Sometimes it's me, sometimes it's not. But we all cheer for them because it's great. But at the end of the day, only one or a small handful actually, win tournaments in a given week. In this, we can all win together. And if you go into props with a disciplined approach, smart bankroll management, good line selection, line shopping across multiple books to get the best line, we can't guarantee anything, but I think it's a reasonable expectation that you're going to turn a profit by the end of a year of doing it. And that's what we've seen in the past. And so I have every expectation that'll continue. And it's fun to win together, like it's a different dynamic than DFS, and it can help fund your DFS tournament play style.
That's awesome, man. Thanks for finishing off with that. If you see the ticker down below, head on over to oneweekseason.com. Check out the Best Ball Plus package, which obviously is going to get you access to all 90 of the one-on-one training sessions that we've done up to this or through this entire off season. Go check out the props packages and also check out the Inner Circle, which is the top tier of DFS product that we offer at 1 Week Season. We'll get you access. You'll hear Xandamere and I talking every Saturday on the Slate podcast, and you'll see additional works and that third level of theoretical thinking that is not really present in a lot of places around the industry. So head on over to oneweekseason.com, check those out. X, thank you for coming on, man. It was great to have you on, and I look forward to talking with you every Saturday, brother.
It's like a warm-up.
Yeah, exactly. Let's do this, man. Have a great rest of your weekend, guys, and we are inching closer to the start of the NFL season. So we will see you in the draft lobbies, and we'll see you at the top of the leaderboards. Peace.